Renewed hostilities, a ceasefire broken. On March 18, 2025, a fragile ceasefire lay shattered. The relative calm over Gaza and Israel was brutally interrupted. The Israeli military launched airstrikes targeting Hamas installations, citing security concerns. This marked a significant escalation, a stark departure from the uneasy truce. The initial airstrikes focused on northern Gaza, a densely populated region. The IDF claimed these were precision attacks, minimizing civilian casualties. However, reports from international observers painted a different picture. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, were quickly inundated with casualties. The wail of ambulance sirens became a haunting soundtrack. A sense of dread and uncertainty gripped Gaza. The ceasefire, a beacon of hope, had been extinguished. The human cost of war casualties and displacement. The human cost of the renewed conflict was immediate and devastating. Palestinian health officials reported a rapidly escalating death toll, with hundreds of civilians, including women and children, killed in the first few days of the Israeli offensive. The Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, the largest medical facility in the Gaza Strip, was overwhelmed with casualties. Doctors and nurses, working tirelessly amidst the chaos and carnage, described scenes of unimaginable suffering. The airstrikes triggered a mass exodus from northern Gaza, as terrified residents fled their homes in search of safety. Makeshift shelters, already overflowing from previous rounds of fighting, struggled to accommodate the influx of displaced families. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, or UNRWA, reported a dire humanitarian situation, with dwindling supplies and limited access to essential services. The stories emerging from Gaza were heart-wrenching. Families huddled in fear, their lives uprooted by the relentless bombardment. Children, their innocence shattered by the trauma of war, bore the psychological scars of witnessing unspeakable horrors. The human cost of the conflict, measured in shattered lives and broken dreams, continued to mount with each passing day. Gaza under siege. Airstrikes and ground offensives. The Israeli military operation, dubbed Operation Iron Shield, rapidly expanded beyond initial airstrikes. Ground forces backed by tanks and artillery pushed into northern Gaza, establishing what the IDF termed a security perimeter. This buffer zone, designed to prevent rocket attacks from Hamas, further squeezed the already confined population of Gaza. The IDF's advance was relentless, marked by heavy fighting and indiscriminate destruction. Residential neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, their streets littered with debris and the remnants of shattered lives. The Israeli military justified its actions, claiming that Hamas used civilians as human shields, operating from within densely populated areas. The ground offensive, coupled with the ongoing airstrikes and artillery bombardment, created a climate of terror and despair. Electricity and water supplies, already intermittent due to the blockade, were further disrupted. Hospitals, struggling to cope with the influx of casualties, faced critical shortages of medical supplies and essential equipment. Gaza, once again, was on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. Hamas's response, a show of defiance. Hamas, the militant group that controls Gaza, responded to the Israeli offensive with defiance. Rocket barrages, while largely ineffective against Israel's Iron Dome defense system, continued to target Israeli towns and cities bordering Gaza. The IDF reported several casualties from rocket attacks, including civilian deaths. Hamas's leadership, vowing to resist the Israeli aggression, framed the conflict as a struggle for Palestinian liberation. They called for international condemnation of Israel's actions and urged the international community to intervene and end the bloodshed. The group's defiant stance, however, did little to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian population in Gaza. Caught between the crossfire of Israeli firepower and Hamas's resistance, civilians bore the brunt of the violence. The escalating cycle of attack and counterattack only deepened the sense of hopelessness and despair. Section 5. Roots of the conflict, tracing back to October 2023. To understand the current crisis, it is essential to delve into the events of October 7, 2023. On that day, Hamas launched a surprise attack on southern Israel, infiltrating Israeli towns and killing over 1,000 Israelis. The attack, unprecedented in its scale and brutality, sent shockwaves through Israeli society and sparked immediate and devastating retaliation. Israel responded with overwhelming force, launching a massive air and ground offensive against Gaza. The IDF's objective, as stated by then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, was to degrade Hamas's military capabilities and restore Israel's deterrence. The ensuing conflict, marked by indiscriminate bombing and heavy civilian casualties, lasted for months. The October 2023 war had a profound impact on both Israelis and Palestinians. For Israelis, it shattered the illusion of security and left deep scars on the national psyche. For Palestinians in Gaza, it resulted in widespread destruction, displacement, and a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. The seeds of the current conflict were sown in the ashes of that devastating war. Section 6. The hostage crisis, a bargaining chip and a humanitarian tragedy. Adding another layer of complexity to the conflict was the issue of hostages taken by Hamas during the October 2023 attack. Over 200 Israelis, including soldiers and civilians, were captured and taken into Gaza. Hamas, using the hostages as bargaining chips, demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails and an end to the blockade of Gaza. Israel, under intense domestic pressure to secure the release of its citizens, engaged in indirect negotiations with Hamas through international mediators. Several rounds of prisoner exchanges took place, resulting in the release of some hostages. However, a significant number remained in captivity. The hostage crisis became a deeply emotional issue for both sides. Israeli families, desperate for the return of their loved ones, pleaded with their government to do everything possible to secure their release. For Palestinians, the hostages represented a rare opportunity to exert leverage over Israel and highlight their own plight. The humanitarian aspect of the crisis, with families on both sides enduring unimaginable anguish, became entangled in the larger political and military calculus of the conflict. Section 7. Turmoil in Israel, political divisions and public outcry. The renewed conflict in Gaza ignited fierce debate and protests within Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu, facing criticism from both the right and left, defended his decision to break the ceasefire, arguing that it was necessary to protect Israeli lives and deter future attacks. He accused Hamas of violating the terms of the truce and using the ceasefire period to rearm. However, Netanyahu's handling of the crisis also sparked dissent within his own government. Several high-ranking officials resigned in protest, citing concerns over the escalating civilian death toll in Gaza and the lack of a clear exit strategy. Public opinion, as reflected in polls, was sharply divided, with many Israelis expressing support for the military operation, but also voicing anxiety over the potential for a protracted conflict. Mass demonstrations, both for and against the war, erupted across Israel. The protests reflected deep divisions within Israeli society over the country's security policies and the ongoing conflict with Hamas. The war in Gaza, once again, exposed the deep fault lines within Israeli society and the lack of a clear consensus on how to achieve lasting peace. Section 8. A world-divided international response and condemnation. The international community's response to the renewed violence in Gaza was swift but largely ineffectual. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting, calling for an immediate ceasefire and a return to negotiations. However, the Council remained divided, with the United States, Israel's closest ally, blocking a resolution that condemned the Israeli offensive. The Biden administration, while expressing support for Israel's right to defend itself, urged restraint and called on both sides to de-escalate the conflict. The United States also pledged additional humanitarian aid to Gaza, but the effectiveness of such aid was limited by the ongoing blockade and the volatile security situation. The European Union, while condemning Hamas's rocket attacks, also criticized Israel's disproportionate use of force and its targeting of civilian infrastructure. Several European countries called for an independent investigation into potential war crimes committed by both sides. The international community's response, while highlighting the global concern over the escalating violence, failed to translate into concrete action that could end the bloodshed. Section 9. A bleak future, the need for dialogue and peace. As the conflict in Gaza rages on, the future remains uncertain and bleak. The cycle of violence, deeply rooted in decades of mistrust and failed peace initiatives, shows no signs of abating. Both sides appear unwilling or unable to break free from the grip of hatred and revenge. The human cost, measured in shattered lives and dreams, is immeasurable. The international community has so far failed to provide a viable path towards peace. The only glimmer of hope lies in dialogue and reconciliation. A lasting solution requires a fundamental shift in mindset. Both sides must recognize the humanity of the other and commit to peaceful coexistence. Until then, the people of Israel and Palestine remain trapped in a cycle of violence.